Remove and replace parts HP OmniBook 7 14-inch laptop AI PC. Tools you need. How to replace the bottom cover. Tools for the task: Torx screwdriver and flat-bladed pry tool. Removal. Place the computer top down on a smooth protected surface. Remove the 3 Torx screws at the corners of the computer. Loosen the 1 captive Torx screw at the top left corner of the computer. Gently use a pry tool to lift the edge of the rear cover starting at the corner with the captive screw. Moving from top to bottom, gently pry the bottom cover up and away from the computer until it is fully released. Lift the bottom cover and remove it from the computer. Replacement. Place the bottom cover in position. Press down on the edges of the cover to secure it to the computer. Replace the 3 Torx screws that secure the bottom cover. Tighten the captive Torx screw. How to replace the battery. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Disconnect the battery cable. Remove the 5 Phillips screws that secure the battery. Remove the battery. Replacement. Place the battery in position. Replace the 5 Phillips screws that secure the battery. Reconnect the battery cable. How to replace the fans. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Lift the tape covering the connectors and disconnect the 2 fan cables. Remove the LCD cable from the fan cable guide. Remove the 4 Phillips screws that secure the fans. Remove the first fan. Remove the second fan. Replacement. Install the second fan in the left fan bay. Place the first fan in position. Replace the 4 Phillips screws that secure the fans. Route the LCD cable through the fan cable guide. Reconnect the 2 fan cables. Replace the tape that covers the connectors. How to replace the heatsink. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver and thermal grease. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Remove the Phillips screw on the right side of the heatsink. Remove the 4 captive Phillips screws that secure the heatsink in numerical order. Lift the heatsink from the bottom to remove it from the computer. Remove any residual thermal grease from the heatsink and processor with a clean cloth. Replacement. Apply a small dot of thermal grease to the processor. Place the heatsink into position, angled slightly down towards the top of the computer. Press the heatsink into position. Replace the 4 captive Phillips screws that secure the heatsink in numerical order. Replace the Phillips screw on the right side of the heatsink. How to replace the wireless LAN module. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver and tweezers. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Remove the Phillips screw that secures the wireless LAN module. Remove the metal cover from the antenna connectors. Disconnect the antenna cables from the wireless LAN module. Use caution to not damage the cables. A damaged cable can degrade performance. Remove the wireless LAN module from the socket. Replacement. Insert the wireless LAN module into the socket at a slight angle. Reconnect the antenna cables to the module. Use caution to not damage the cables. A damaged cable can degrade performance. Replace the metal cover over the antenna connectors. Replace the Phillips screw to secure the wireless LAN module. How to replace the solid-state drive. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Remove the 2 Phillips screws that secure the SSD shield. Lift the SSD shield to remove it from the computer. Grasp the SSD by its sides and pull back to remove it from the socket. Replacement. Align the SSD pins with the SSD socket. Insert the SSD into its socket at a slight angle. Replace the SSD shield. Replace the 2 screws that secure the SSD shield. How to replace the expandable SSD shield. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Remove the 2 Phillips screws that secure the shield. Lift the SSD shield to remove it from the computer. Replacement. Place the SSD shield into position. Replace the 2 screws that secure the SSD shield. How to replace the port board. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver and tweezers. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover. Removal. Lift the black clasp on the ribbon cable. Pull the ribbon cable up and out to disconnect it from the board. Remove the 2 Phillips screws that secure the port board. Remove the port board. Replacement. Place the port board into position. Replace 2 Phillips screws that secure the port board. Align the pins on the ribbon cable with the port board socket and insert the cable into the socket. Press down on the black clasp to secure the ribbon cable. How to replace the speakers. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover and the battery. Removal. Disconnect the speaker cable from the motherboard. Remove the 4 screws that secure the speakers. Remove the speaker cable from the computer cable routing guides. Lift the speakers to remove them from the computer. Replacement. Place the speakers in position on the computer. Place the speaker cable in the computer cable routing guides. Replace the 4 Phillips screws that secure the speakers. Reconnect the speaker connector to the motherboard. How to replace the touchpad. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, battery, and speakers. Removal. Lift any clear protective tape that may be covering the touchpad or touchpad cable. Lift the black clasp and pull the touchpad cable to disconnect the touchpad connector. Remove the 4 Phillips screws that secure the touchpad bracket. Remove the touchpad bracket. Remove the 3 Phillips screws that secure the touchpad. Remove the tape from the touchpad. Lift the touchpad up and out of the computer. Replacement. Place the touchpad in position. Replace the tape on the touchpad. Replace the 3 Phillips screws that secure the touchpad. Replace the touchpad bracket. Replace the 4 Phillips screws that secure the touchpad bracket. Insert the touchpad connector into the port. Press down on the black clasp to secure the touchpad connector in its port. Replace any clear protective tape that may be covering the touchpad or touchpad cable. How to replace the motherboard. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, fans, heatsink, SSD expansion shield, battery, the wireless LAN module, and port board. Removal. Disconnect any remaining connectors from the motherboard. Remove the 6 Phillips screws that secure the motherboard. Lift the motherboard up and out of the computer. Replacement. Place the motherboard in position on the computer. Replace the 6 Phillips screws that secure the motherboard. Reconnect all connectors to the motherboard. How to replace the display bezel. Tools for the task: flat-bladed tool and tweezers. Removal. Using a flat-bladed tool, very gently pry the display bezel away from the display. Separate the bezel from the top, sides, and bottom of the display. Caution! There is stretch release tape securing the bezel to the display. Carefully grasp the end of the tape and gently pull the tape out to remove it. Remove the display bezel. Replacement. Apply new dual-sided tape to the display bezel. Place the bezel into position on the display. Press in on the edges of the bezel until it snaps into place. How to replace the hinges. Tools for the task: Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, display bezel, and wireless LAN module. Removal. Disconnect the LCD cable, power cable, and camera cable. Remove the 6 Phillips screws that secure the hinges. Open the hinges to 90 degrees. Carefully place the computer over the edge of the table. Remove the 2 Phillips screws at the top of the hinges. Lift the display panel with the hinges up and out of the computer. Remove the 4 Phillips screws that secure the left hinge. Remove the 4 Phillips screws that secure the right hinge. Remove the hinges from the display panel. Replacement. Place the hinges into position on the display. Replace the 4 Phillips screws that secure the right hinge. Replace the 4 Phillips screws that secure the left hinge. Align the hinges with the computer at a 90-degree angle. Replace the 2 Phillips screws that secure the hinges. Close the hinges. Replace the 6 Phillips screws that secure the hinges. Reconnect the LCD cable, power cable, and camera cable. How to replace the display panel. Tools for the task: tweezers. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, display bezel, wireless LAN module, and hinges. Removal. The display panel is held in place with 2 strips of stretch release tape. Using tweezers, grasp the end of the tape near the hinges and pull out on the tape. Rotate the tweezers to slowly pull and remove the tape. Repeat this process on the other side of the display panel. Remove the display panel. Replacement. Replace the stretch release tape around the perimeter of the display panel. Place the display panel into position on the top cover. How to replace the camera. Tools for the task: flat-bladed tool. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, display bezel, wireless LAN module, display panel, and hinges. Removal. Disconnect the camera cable. Use a flat-bladed tool to gently remove the camera from the adhesive. Remove the camera. Replacement. Place the camera into position on the top cover. Reconnect the camera cable. How to replace the top cover. No tools are required to remove or install this assembly. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, display bezel, wireless LAN module, display panel, hinges, and camera. Removal. Remove all parts from the old top cover to replace them on the new top cover. Remove the top cover. Replacement. Place the top cover into position. Replace all parts from the old top cover on the new top cover. How to replace the keyboard cover. No tools are required to remove or install this assembly. Before you begin, remove the bottom cover, speakers, touchpad, fans, heatsink, SSD expansion shield, battery, wireless LAN module, port board, and motherboard. Removal. Remove all parts from the old keyboard cover to replace them on the new keyboard cover. Remove the keyboard cover. Replacement. Place the keyboard cover into position. Replace all parts from the old keyboard cover on the new keyboard cover.